So let's get going. I'm going to begin with an old New Yorker cartoon. It goes something like this. A businessman's kind of walking down the street, three-piece suit, he's got his suitcase, his briefcase, and up behind him comes this very intimidating looking mugger, puts the gun in the business person's back and says, "Your money or your life?" And the businessman doesn't panic, doesn't freak out. In fact, seems to ponder the question before finally answering, "I never take the first offer." And so in life, it seems that everything is a negotiation. Those of you out there who have a spouse or worse yet, a teenager, you know that everything in life is a negotiation. That's especially true in a context of the legislature, where the constant clash of agendas and priorities and objectives equals a constant churn of negotiation. I think that might even be more so true in something like the realm of redistricting. So it's worth pausing here this morning to ask ourselves, if that's what we're doing all the time, are we doing it in the most effective way? In the way that can solve the problems that plague us, whether those are problems of policy or in redistricting process and procedure, and are we doing it in the way that creates the most optimal solutions for all the stakeholders who are involved? So I want to welcome you here this morning to day 2 of the redistricting seminar and to the art of legislative negotiation. My name is Kurt Stetter, and I'm the Director of Legislative Training at NCSL. And what you're about to experience over the next hour is a partnership, the result of a partnership between NCSL and our academic partners at Harvard University and American University to create a training module for negotiation that's specifically oriented to the legislature. That's not necessarily what you might see in the business or the legal realm. And so what we're trying to do is develop a skill set, and I think more importantly, a mindset to achieve results more like this. I'll let that sort of sneak up on you, and less like this. Because there are particular challenges to negotiating effectively in a legislative environment that are different than you might see in the legal environment or the business world. So just to kind of get us warmed up, it's early in the morning. And by the way, I'm going to ask you to do this several times, so keep your fingers limber and loosened. I'm going to ask you to put your fingers on your keyboard, go to the chat, and actually let's get a list of some of the challenges that you've experienced or you anticipate experiencing that get in the way, the barriers to effective negotiation in the legislative setting, maybe as it relates to redistricting, or frankly, even as it relates to any other topic that you have experience trying to negotiate. So what are some of those barriers that get in the way? Throw those into the chat so we can all sort of see your ideas and your collective wisdom about this particular topic. What gets in the way of us negotiating effectively? Okay, intimidation by the majority party, time and the rush, the process gets condensed, right? Being in a super minority where you feel like you're not even part of the negotiation process. Emotions, thank you, Kate, for that one. That's a great one. People get all upset about things, adherence to ideology, 2 different sets of facts. Oh my God, you guys are doing really, really well. So all of those seem to have some connection, dovetail a little bit with what our research has shown us. In interviews with hundreds of legislators over the last few years, we find these are the 4 main problems that get cited over and over and over again. This partisanship and polarization that we're all so familiar with. Also, the fact that we are negotiating now, not in the smoke-filled room of yore, closed off from the world, but we're doing this in a constant fishbowl where everything is being broadcasted out. It's a state of permanent campaign. I mean, look, the Georgia election ended yesterday. They're probably campaigning again starting today for the next election. And then finally, this idea that we are simultaneously negotiating externally, perhaps caucus to caucus or chamber to chamber, but we're also at the same time negotiating internally within the caucus or within the chamber. And all those things lead to very strong obstacles in our pursuit of effective solutions to our problems. So if this redistricting meeting was happening live in a room somewhere in a more human environment than Zoom, what I would do right now is you'd each have a role, and we do a simulation of a negotiation. And the reason we do that is twofold. One, to see what our natural negotiating tendencies are, and also to have a little bit of a context to reference back from some of the things we're going to talk about here later this morning. Unfortunately, in a Zoom scenario, it's impossible for me to pair you up and give you the roles that you're going to play so that you can actually have that simulation. So we're going to have to do something that's not quite as wonderful, And that is, I am going to do a one-man show. I'm going to act out the simulation that you would have been a part of. And I'm going to warn you at the outset, I am not a trained thespian. This is going to be awful, but bear with me. It's only about a minute long. So here's how the scenario would have played out had we been all together. I would have shown you this wonderful tea kettle. And I said, we're at a flea market right now. And one of you in the pair is the prospective buyer of this tea kettle, and one of you in the pair is the prospective seller of this tea kettle. And each of you would have a prep sheet with some information that only you knew about. But today you have the wonderful omniscient you get to look down into both brains. I'm going to show you what the information would have been for both the buyer and the seller. So the seller, you see the information there on the left column. They're asking $100 for this tea kettle. They paid $40 for that, so that's their cost, but you'll note that's the lowest that the seller is instructed to actually take a deal for. The best offer of the day was $55. This customer said that they're going to come back later, but who knows if they really will. The buyer, on the other hand, in the right-hand column, they have $70 in cash in their wallet or their purse. That's all they're willing to pay. Earlier today at the flea market on another aisle somewhere else, they saw a different tea kettle. That was only $55, but they liked this one a little bit better. And then I would do this instruction before we started the simulation. I would tell both sides, I'd say, your goal is to get the best possible deal. I let you define what best possible deal means according to your own definition. And so with all that in mind, you would have done the simulation, but instead I'm going to act out the tea kettle scenario for you. And you can sort of see that information there and watch it as I go through the simulation. Again, a warning, I am not a trained actor. This will not be up for the Academy Awards this year. So here we go. My, that's a beautiful tea kettle. I really admire the colors. How much are you asking for it? Well, it's a very rare tea kettle indeed. In fact, it's an antique, and I am impressed that you notice its beautiful colorization. I'm asking $100 for that. Ooh, $100, that's way, way past my budget. Well, go ahead and make me an offer. Perhaps we can make a deal today. Well, I hope this isn't insulting, but probably $30 about the most that I could possibly pay for that. Well, it's far more valuable than $30. I mentioned that it's an antique, and we've already agreed that it has beautiful coloring. But you seem like a really nice person. I guess I could come down to $80, but just for you. Well, I saw another one earlier today for a lot less than that, but this one is a little bit nicer. I do prefer it. I guess I could come up to $40. Well, I've already had a number of people interested in this today at a much higher price than that. But who knows? They might not come back, and I'd rather take a bird in hand instead of two in the bush. I guess I could come down to $70. Ooh, the most I could possibly pay would be $50. I guess I'll just have to go look at that other one that I saw earlier today. Goodbye. Oh, no. Don't go. I can see how much you like it, and I feel like you should be together. How about $60? That's the absolute lowest I can possibly go. I don't know. That's still awfully steep. I think 50 is as high as I can go. It's an incredible deal. It's very rare, and it's beautifully colored. Could we maybe split the difference, meet in the middle? How about $55? $55? Okay, deal. End scene. So again, I'm so sorry that this early in the morning, that's the first thing that you had to deal with here today. My apologies for my lack of acting talent. But what I will tell you is I've done this scenario now with hundreds and hundreds of legislators and staff and private sector folks, and what you saw here is essentially the same basic process, and more importantly, the same basic outcome that has happened in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sample size events. And when I ask at the end how they define that best possible deal, by and large, the people on the seller side said, I was trying to get the highest price possible. And by and large, when I asked the buyer side, they say, I was trying to get the lowest price that I probably could. And maybe you're not surprised by this. The way this played out, this sort of mindset and method is the most common method that we see in the business world, in the legal world, and unfortunately, I think in the legislative world as well. But as we're going to explore today and play around with some ideas today, it may not be the most optimal method to try to find effective solutions when that constant clash of agendas, priorities, and objectives, particularly in the redistricting realm, happen in the legislative environment. So with all that as a preamble, we're going to refer back to the tea kettle several times today. let's get started on the sort of material. I'm going to introduce you to two cool negotiation terms today. So if you get nothing else out of the hour that we spend here today, next time you're at a dinner party, next time we can have dinner parties, and someone talks about negotiation, you'll be able to drop these two terms in and they'll think you're a master negotiator. So the first of those terms is what we call the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. What you see there is the range of the seller and the range of the buyer, sort of what the seller wants to get and what they're willing to come down to, what the buyer would like to get it for and what they're willing to come up to. And that overlapping, that in the green, that's what we call the ZOPA, the zone of possible agreement. So now I'm going to show you what the ZOPA was for the tea kettle. You would not have known this had you had only played one role, but you got to see both roles, so maybe you already figured this out. But the seller wanted $100 for the tea kettle. They were willing to come down to $40, which is how much they paid for it. The buyer, of course, would love to get it for free, but they're willing to come up to $70, which is how much cash they had in their wallet. And so our ZOPA in this scenario was between $40 and $70. And you will note, and by the way, this is the part in the simulate when we do it live, that somebody goes, oh, could have got it for less, or I could have sold it for more. It's called the winner's curse. Once you kind of know what they're willing to do, you're upset that you made the deal. Problem with the ZOPA is it creates an expectation of haggling. Once both sides start to realize there is a ZOPA, all of a sudden this idea is we need to haggle. In fact, if we weren't in Zoom, I'd show you this great clip from Monty Python. Any millennials out there, you need to know that Monty Python was this comedy troupe from Britain in the 70s. Anyway, they did this great bit where a person walks into essentially a flea market, asks, hey, how much for this item? And the seller says, 20 shekels. And he says, fine. And he gives him 20 shekels. And then the seller goes, no. We're supposed to haggle. And then there's this whole funny bit about how the buyer doesn't know how to haggle and the seller has to teach him how to haggle. So it's hardwired into us. It's in our art. Certainly it's the reason we didn't like to go to the car dealer before like the standard pricing, because we knew that we were going to be involved in this haggling. So that's the problem with the ZOPA, is it creates this expectation of haggling and our natural tendency takes us there. So we're going to look at two different negotiation paradigms today. One, positional bargaining, which is what just happened in the tea kettle scenario. And then the second, this idea of an interest-based, an alternative way to think about negotiation. So positional bargaining, shown in that Venn diagram, is oppositional. Everything I get comes at your expense. Everything you get comes at my expense. We are adversaries. We are not partners. Interest-based, completely different mindset, completely different paradigm. We are trying to overlap our Venn diagram circles to get the widest possible overlap. We don't see ourselves as adversaries. We see ourselves as creative partners coming together for the most elegant solution that we can possibly have. So while we're going to spend obviously a lot of time on that second paradigm of interest-based negotiation, it's helpful to look at what positional bargaining is and why it may not be useful in the legislative setting, because that's what most people are naturally inclined to do. So what is positional bargaining? Well, essentially, it is this strategy that asserts a position. This is what I want, and that's what I want. And once those positions have been articulated, that's what the whole conversation is about. We can only see things in terms of those positions, and we ignore these little interests, these things called interests that I'm going to define here in just a minute, too much, and we spend our time talking about positions. So I like to use this metaphor of sort of, if we plant a flag, like this is what I want, and this is what I want, and all we do is spend our time talking about these things up here, and we ignore these underlying things called interests that might be the way forward toward an agreement. So once we've established these flags, what happens then is the haggling kicks in. We sense the ZOPA, and we do what I like to call this dance to the middle of the ZOPA. We just sort of, here's what I want, here's what I want. Well, I'll come to here, I'll come to here, I'll come to here. And we dance to the middle of the ZOPA. We engage in this kind of gruesome, relationship burning, tense process, coming to an almost preordained solution that leaves both sides unsatisfied. It's what we saw in the tea kettle, right? It started with 100, started with 30. Where'd we end up? Right in the middle of ZOPA at $55. So I want you to note two things about this dance to the middle, though. The first is when we get to that middle, we sort of have a suboptimal outcome for both parties. It's Solomon splitting the baby in half. It's half a loaf. You don't get all the things you want. In fact, you very often don't get any of the things you really want, those things called interest we'll talk about in a minute. That's the first thing that's a problem. Second thing that's a problem is the arbitrary nature of where we tend to plant those flags. Let's look back at the tea kettle scenario for a second. The seller is asking $100 for the tea kettle, but they only paid $40 for it. That's ridiculous markup. Anyone out there who's in business knows that's a wonderful margin. I wish I could get it, but the best offer of the day is $55. So that's really what the value of that tea kettle is, but they're planting their flag at $100. The buyer, on the other hand, is only willing to pay $70, and that's a function of an arbitrary thing, which is how much cash they brought to the flea market. What if they brought $20 in cash? What if they brought $90 in cash? The flags would have been planted in different places, and the dance to the middle would have resulted in a different outcome. And the biggest problem with positional bargaining is this, and I think you've probably all seen this in the legislative environment or in your own private negotiations in life. If what's expected is a positional bargaining game, planting of flags, dance to the middle, then we have an incentive from the outset to plant our flags as outrageously far apart as possible so that when we dance, we get to something that we're willing to accept. The problem with that, of course, is expressed here by Orlando Batista when he says, the fellow who says he'll meet you halfway is usually standing on the dividing line. Where those flags get planted determines the outcome of a dance to the middle. And while positional bargaining might be wonderful for the flea market, it really might be. It's fast, it's easy, doesn't take a lot of preparation, doesn't take a lot of skill. It may not be the right method for something as complex as the legislature, particularly in the sub-context of redistricting, where we have multi-party, multi-stakeholder, multi-issue, all combining together in the crux of that one particular negotiation. So positional bargaining isn't the best method for the legislature. What might be an alternative to consider? By the way, I do want to note that I'm saying to consider. I'm not a proselytizer here. I'm not ordering you to use this. I just want you to understand the two different paradigms and you decide when to apply either or neither. So the other option that you have is what we call interest-based negotiation. Completely different, not that oppositional zero-sum game, but a creative way between two partners to meet not the positions, but these things we call interest that I'll define here in just a minute. There's two quotes there that I think sort of sum up the spirit of interest-based negotiation. They're not my quotes. They come from our partner, Brian Mandel at Harvard. He says, the art of letting other people have it your way. That's kind of a good way to think about interest-based negotiation, or write the other side's victory speech. Give them something to go home and crow about, to feel good about. I like to add one on, and that is I think the difference between positional bargaining and interest-based negotiation can be summed up in this way, in a spirit. And the spirit is to deliver rather than to deny. Too often we go into a negotiation thinking, I need to deny them things. But if you go into it with the spirit of, I can deliver things for them and hopefully reciprocally get things that I want as well. Deliver, not deny. That's the big shift. That's the big change. So maybe the easiest way to explain the difference is with a visual metaphor. So I'll use this one. Positional bargaining, as you see there on the left, is a fixed pie game. Every crumb that I get comes at your expense, and I'm going to fight and burn relationships and really make it difficult. And I'm going to try and get a few more crumbs on my side and a few less crumbs on your side. Alternatively, in the interest-based world, we want to expand the pie before we start to carve that pie up. In negotiation speak, we say we want to create value before we start to claim value. So let's do a little bit of math here. Maybe you weren't expecting to do math this early in the morning, but we're going to do some math. So imagine on that left-hand pie, there's 100 units of pie. Looks like one person's got about 80 units and the other person's got about 20 units of pie. So that's the deal that they've got in a positional bargaining game. But imagine if we could have some ways to expand that pie from 100 units to 200 units of pie. Now we have a 200 unit pie, and even if we carve it up in the exact same proportions as before, you've gone from 20 units of pie to 40 units of pie. You've doubled your pie. You've made a much better deal for yourself, but here's the hard part of interest-based negotiation. Here's the part you have to be willing to accept. You've gone from 20 to 40, but they've gone from 80 to 160. Both sides have done better. And very often, particularly in the legislature, that's unacceptable. I will stick with my 20 units so that you don't get those 160 units, and both of us come out, and our stakeholders, our constituents, the citizens of our states end up losing. So in order to accept this paradigm on the right, we have to change two really common definitions that are part of negotiation. The first is this definition of a good compromise. If we're in the room right now, I'd say, what's the old definition of a good compromise? And somebody'd raise their hand and say, it's when both sides are unhappy, right? We've all heard that one before. You need to change that in your mind to, instead of both sides are unhappy, both sides are as happy as they could possibly be. But the second definition you have to be willing to change is this idea of the best possible deal. That's what I instructed the tea kettle participants to try to get. In the old method, the definition of a best possible deal is I have to beat you. That's the old definition. I have to beat you. But the new definition, an interest-based definition, would say I need to beat me. If I can come up with a deal that's better for me than the deal I had before, I should accept that deal no matter how much better it is for my negotiating partner. Look, don't take it from me. Take it from J. Paul Getty, who at one point was the richest private citizen in the history of the world. You would expect him to be the most cutthroat, tough as nails negotiator, tries to win everything. But he tells us this. He says, you must never try to make all the money in a deal. Let the other person make some money too, because if you have a reputation for always making all the money, then you won't have many deals. Think about this, particularly in the context of the legislature. If you're always out there to win every single time, nobody wants to play the game with you. You win every time. Why should I continue to interact with you? So with all that as a preamble, let's get into the really nitty-gritty of interest-based negotiation. We have 4 principles that we're going to try and understand and discuss and process: alternatives, interests, options, and this concept of legitimacy. So let's start with the first, alternatives. It's a little bit different in negotiation speak than it is in the way we normally use it in English usage. Essentially, it means this: if we don't make a deal, what else am I going to do? What are my alternatives? So I told you I was going to introduce you to 2 cool negotiation terms. The first was ZOPA, that zone of possible agreement between 2 parties. The second is also an acronym, and it's BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So you see that same graphic up there. You got the seller, what they want up here and what they're willing to come down to. But let's just say the seller came down to $40 and the buyer is still only offering $30. They're not going to make a deal. The seller has to consider what their BATNA is. What are all the alternatives I can do if I don't make a deal with this buyer? Whatever the best one is, that's their BATNA. The buyer came up to $70, all the cash they have in their wallet, but the seller still wants $80. They're not going to make a deal. The buyer has to consider, what are all my alternatives? Whatever the best one is, that's their BATNA. So in the tea kettle scenario, both of them had alternatives. The seller could wait for the other person to come back. They could bring it home with them today and bring it back next week to the flea market, try and sell it. They could take it home and make it their own tea kettle. Whichever the best one is, that's their BATNA. And the buyer has alternatives as well. They could go buy the other tea kettle they saw earlier that day. They could stop at Target on the way home and buy a tea kettle. They could use the tea kettle they have at home already. They have some alternatives. Whatever they think the best one is, that's their BATNA. Now, BATNAs are important to consider because they determine leverage in the negotiation, and knowing your BATNA, being aware of your BATNA and being aware of your opponent or partner's BATNA is a really important thing. Sometimes you have a good BATNA. Sometimes you have some leverage. I'd argue when you're shopping for a new car, you've got a pretty good BATNA. You can go to Ford dealer number 1. If they won't make a deal with you, you can go to Ford dealer down the street. If they won't make a deal with you, you might switch over to a different brand and try a Honda, maybe try a Chevrolet or Subaru. You've got a lot of alternatives and pretty good Bs, pretty good bests out there. Sometimes, though, you have no leverage at all. Sometimes you have a terrible BATNA. All your alternatives are terrible. I'd argue when you are a hostage negotiator, you do not have a particularly strong BATNA. You better keep negotiating, keep that dialogue going, keep trying to find a solution to your problem. Bottom line for this first principle is that good negotiators assess their BATNA and the BATNA of the person they're negotiating with in advance. You think, if we can't make a deal, what are the things I could do? What's the best one? What are the things they could do? What's the best one? So that you begin that conversation knowing those things in your mind, or at least having some sense of those things in your mind. Which leads me to a little bit of a shadow principle for our hour here today, and that is this idea of preparation. Look, I know time was listed in the chat box as one of the real pressures to good negotiation in the legislature. And that is a problem, but you've got to do your homework in advance. I'm going to talk about that probably 3 different times here this morning. And the first is thinking about these BATNAs before you get into the room. If you're walking down the hallway and you're having the negotiation season, that's the first time you've thought about what you're going to do if you don't make a deal, or you thought about what their BATNA is if you don't make a deal. That's not the time to do it. You need to do those things in advance. So that's the first principle, alternatives. Second principle, talked about this term 3 or 4 times. Now we're finally going to define it. This idea of interests. Interests are different than positions. Positions are the flags. They're the thing they say they want, but interests are what they really want. I like to think of them as the why behind the position. People ask for a thing, but there's a reason they want that thing, and that reason is sometimes very different terrain than the thing that they are asking for. I'll give you another visual metaphor to try to explain the difference between positions and interests. And I'll use an iceberg here because you can see some of the iceberg, but then there's a lot of it submerged beneath the waterline. So what you want, that position, that's pretty clear. That's what they state. That's the flag they're flying. Why they want it, those are the interests that are often submerged. They're not going to throw those cards on the table. So let me give you a real example here for context. Let's say you're a business owner or something, or a manager, and someone comes to you and says, one of your employees says, I want a $5,000 raise. You're like, well, that's a flag, right? That's a position. I'm taking a position. I want $5,000. And you're thinking, well, I can only give you $1,000. And then you census open, you start to dance in the middle, and you arrive at $3,000. The problem, of course, with that is they wanted 5 and you wanted 1. Both of you are unhappy. So that's what happens in positional bargaining. That's what happens in the dance in the middle. When we think about interest, all of a sudden we start to probe a little bit. Why do you want $5,000? Well, I need the money. I'm going to be moving soon. I've got some short-term moving costs to get there. I've got some long-term increases in rent. Okay, we're starting to get somewhere. You keep probing. Why do you need the $5,000? Well, I just want to be clear here. I haven't gotten a raise in 3 years. I feel stuck in my position, my job. I'm just sort of in a rut. Ding, 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 ding. I don't feel appreciated. So I want you to note 2 things here right now. One, the position, I want $5,000, is completely different than the interest. I want some validation and appreciation for the work I've done here. And here's a really important thing to note. Satisfying a position, the $5,000, is not the same thing as satisfying the interest. Very often in our redistricting or other legislative negotiations, we can't give them the position they're asking for. But very often, if we're willing to probe enough and have enough of a conversation to find out the why and really dig out interests, not just one, but multiple interests, very often we can give some high value to them interests that are low cost to us, even though we can't satisfy that position. So once again, there's a little bit of a preparation theme here, and that is to think in advance about what your interests are. This is what I'm saying I want, but why do I really want it? And thinking about what their interests are, because they're not necessarily going to tell you what their interests are. They're just going to tell you what their position is. So how do you find out what their interests are? The answer, of course, is to talk. Talk, and specifically to ask a question over and over and over again. And that question is why? Why? Don't stop asking why until you've uncovered a number of interests that might possibly be part of a deal, even if a position cannot be rewarded. Look, Eli Broad, famous industrialist, maybe you've been to the Broad Museum in Los Angeles. This is his philosophy of negotiation. He says the best move you can make in a negotiation is to think of an interest, not a position, an interest that the other person hasn't even thought of, and then meet it. In your conversation of why, you may uncover some reasons they want things that they didn't even know or understand, and now you can actually deliver that. Remember, it's to deliver, not to deny. That's the spirit of interest-based. Let's practice this for a little bit. Get your fingers warmed up. We're going to be in the chat bar here in just a second. Maybe some of you are fans of HGTV, Home and Garden Television. If so, you've seen all these kind of flip or flop, these remodeling shows. But one that I really like is House Hunters, because House Hunters is a case study in negotiation every single week. If you haven't seen the show, it's a couple. They're looking for a new house. They have their wish list that don't match up. They see a couple properties and they have to sort of have a negotiation about which one they're going to end up buying. So let's imagine that in that, we have this clash. They're at loggerheads because one member of the couple wants a third bedroom. They're stating a position. They're flying a flag. I need a third bedroom. It doesn't matter how many gorgeous 2 bedrooms in the right neighborhood at the right price in the right school district with the right features. It doesn't matter how many 2-bedroom houses they see. They're not going to make a deal because this person wants a 3rd bedroom. So right now in the chat, I want you to imagine the interest that underlies this position. They say they want a 3rd bedroom, but the question to you is, why do they want a 3rd bedroom? What are all the possible reasons that somebody would want a 3rd bedroom? Go ahead and just toss them in the chat. How many different reasons are there that somebody would need one? Privacy. They want their home office. They're going to expand the family. They want an office space. Storage. Exercise room. Plan on expanding the family. Okay, you guys are all on the same page. In-law suite. Yeah, far away. They want a 3rd bedroom in the back corner. Okay, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. So the question here is, and this is rhetorical, don't answer it in the chat. Is there a way to satisfy most or all the things you just put in the chat, the interest, without giving them the position of the 3rd bedroom? It's a rhetorical question, and it leads us perfectly into our 3rd principle of interest-based negotiation, which is options. So options are the thing that I think allows an interest-based negotiation model to be a little bit more enjoyable than the slog of positional bargaining, right? It's finding creative ways, you and your partner working together to find creative ways to fulfill the maximum amount of total interest, your interest and their interest. It's a very different mindset, right, than denying them those things. Remember, the spirit is to deliver, not to deny. So you're working together creatively, an intellectual problem to try to cobble together a deal that satisfies the maximum number of interests, even if the positions cannot be satisfied. So the way to do this, of course, is also through conversation. And it's another set of questions, only this question isn't why, which uncovers interest, but it's what if? What if we tried this? What if we did this? What about this solution? What? And their response to that helps guide you toward more optimal and elegant solutions. I actually like the second question construction there. What would be wrong with X, Y, or Z? The reason I like that question, I strongly suggest you use that constantly in your negotiation conversations, is when they tell you what's wrong with X, Y, or Z, they are also telling you new interests, things that they may not have been willing to reveal or even knew that they held as important. What would be wrong with this? Well, this would be wrong with it, and that would be wrong with it, and that would be wrong with it. Now you start to get a better sense of what their interests are. Let me give you an example, another metaphor to sort of explain this idea of options. Let's say that 2 people show up at a supermarket. They park in the parking lot, and they both have in their mind, I need an orange, an entire orange for something that I'm about to make. And they both enter from different entrances in the supermarket, and they weave their way back to the produce section, and they see the orange stand, and there's one orange on top of the stand. And they race to the orange, and they both grab a hand on it, and they have this tug of war. Now, in the old positional bargaining method, we do the Solomon cut the baby in half, we do half a loaf, and we'd end up with option 1. Of course, the problem with option 1 is that it's a suboptimal outcome. Both of them came to the supermarket wanting an entire orange, and they're going home with half an orange. It's the old definition of a good compromise. Both sides are unhappy. But a whole orange is just a position. I need an orange. I need an orange. It's just a position. But now we know about interests. And we start to probe with the why questions. And one person says, well, why do you need the orange? And the person says, well, I need the meat of the orange for a mandarin salad that I'm creating. And then the other person says, why do you need the orange? Well, I need some zest off the rind of the orange for a cake that I'm making. And voila, we come up with the creative option 2. And of course, you can see a maximum number of interests fulfilled. Much more elegant solution to the problem simply because the spirit and the process led us to this outcome. So let's practice this as well. So imagine somebody actually said this, that the interest for that person had for the 3rd bedroom was a workout space. That's the interest. You finally threw the why, and cover, hey, that's the reason they're just stuck on this 3rd bedroom. So in the chat bar right now, go ahead and list every possible way, every possible option you can come up with to deliver the interest, the workout space, without delivering the position, the 3rd bedroom. Let's see what kind of creative ideas you come up with for that. Okay, convert the garage. Yeah, make the garage. What if their home's near a new gym? Give them a membership. Well, you can use the basement, the garage area, gym. Okay, a lot of same ideas. Add a shed. Okay, that's one I haven't heard before. Good job, Gina. Very creative. You're good at this. Creates foldable workout equipment. Okay, we can put it under the bed. We can hide it into a closet. An attic. Oh, Madeline, good job. I haven't heard that one before either. Excellent. These are all very low cost to you, by the way, if you're the 2-bedroom person, and high value to them. So you're getting it. This is the spirit of options, but you don't get to this option until you understand what the interest is. If you're still staring at the 3-bedroom flag and I'm over here with the 2-bedroom flag, there's no way to get a 2.5-bedroom place. You got to get to interest first before you can get to options. What I like about the gym membership one, so for all of you that just typed in gym membership, one, the party that wanted the 3rd bedroom gets their workout space. The party that wanted the 2-bedroom house gets the 2-bedroom house they wanted in the neighborhood they wanted. And the beauty for both of them is it ends up being win-win and then another win, because the difference in price of a 2-bedroom house in that neighborhood to a 3-bedroom house in that neighborhood is about $150,000. And now both of them have an extra $150,000 that they can spend on their kids' education or trips to Hawaii or whatever it is they want. Here's what I would say. Options, this principle, is the reason you joined or are part of the legislature in the first place. This is why you came to the legislature, to be creative, to engage with the brains of others, to figure out elegant solutions that have maximum power and deliver the most elegant or the widest amount of interest to all stakeholders involved. This is what options is why you became a legislator or you became a legislative staff. Let me get to the 4th and final principle here. And for this, I'm going to show you a quick little video. Those of you that have used Zoom and videos know that sound is weird in the Zoom world. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to narrate this video. It's very short. I'll narrate for you since you won't be able to hear the sound. Before I show it to you, though, I need you to understand one thing about capuchin monkeys. They like cucumbers. They're perfectly fine with cucumbers. They'll eat a cucumber, but they love, and I mean love, 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 love grapes. So having said that, let's check out what happens here. So this person gives a rock to the researcher and they get a cucumber. All right, they did the task, they get a cucumber. The other person gives a rock to the researcher and here's the rock and they get a grape. And the other one sees that they got a grape for that. So then they give a rock back and they get a cucumber. And they're very upset about that. Something about that has rubbed them the wrong way. So if we were in the room together right now, I'd say, what's the problem here? Why is the monkey so upset? And somebody would say, well, it's unfair, it's unjust, it's violation of the principles of justice. And you're right, that gets us to the 4th and final principle here that we want to talk about this morning. And that's this idea that we call legitimacy in the negotiation world. And essentially what that means is that we need to have some sort of standard or criteria benchmark that legitimizes the requests, the flags that we fly, or even the interests that we have. Our partner, Bruce Patton at Harvard, likes to say, why that number? When that worker comes to you and says, I want a $5,000 raise, why that number? Is that in line with our salary bands? Is that, somewhat attached to the merit or the value you bring to the organization? Why that number? So we already talked about the arbitrary positions that people are incentivized to take in position of bargaining, right? You have an incentive to plant your flag as far away as you possibly can because you think you're going to do this dance to the middle. But those are often very illegitimate places to plant a flag, and legitimacy helps us rein those things in. Let me give you a great example. So in the real estate market, people fall in love with their houses. They've lived there for 20 years. They're emotionally attached to it. They've had holidays there. Their kids have grown up there. They have some door frame somewhere where they checked off how tall Johnny was every year. And so when it comes time to sell the house, they have an inflated sense of the value of that house because they've imbued it with their own emotional relationship. And so they ask a super high price, but there's a standard of legitimacy in the real estate market that reins that in. They're called real estate comps. We can look up the comps. And so if the person on the left says, my house is worth $1 million because I love it so much, because my kids grew up here, you can show them, hey, that's an illegitimate position. I have a criteria, benchmark, a standard. The average house that looks like the house on the right in this neighborhood is only $500,000. Imagine if you hadn't done your homework in advance, theme number 3 on preparation, and you didn't come with your standard of legitimacy, and you actually engaged in positional bargaining dance in the middle here, $1 million, $500,000, you would have paid $750,000 for that crappy house on the left. That's the problem without having a standard of legitimacy. By the way, a little side note. If you live in California and you see a house like that for $1 million, you should buy it because that's a steal. In fact, if you have the resources, you should buy 2 of them because that is a super good deal. So the reason we want to have a standard of legitimacy is threefold. It limits the playing field. It sort of reins things in, right? It creates this parameter around the conversation of the negotiation. It keeps it real, if you will, to use the millennial or Gen Z term. It reins in those extreme positions that positional bargaining incentivizes us to take. So, as I mentioned, it's a preparation thing. You need to come to the table having done your homework in advance, having had a sense of what the standard of legitimacy should be, because if you don't have one, you're going to be stuck using theirs. In the end, I urge you to simply become the true car of the legislature, always ready with the information to rein those crazy asks in. And I think that's particularly important in the redistricting realm. So let's review what we've already talked about here today. We've learned a lot in 45 minutes. First principle is this idea of alternatives. What's my best alternative? What's my bat net if this thing doesn't happen? And how strong or weak is that relative to them? And what is their bat net? If we don't make a deal, I need to project myself into their brain. What are their alternatives and what's the best one that they have? Interests. What do I really want? I know I'm asking for this, but what do I really want? I know they're asking for this. What do they really want? Let's dig down and find out what those interests is. Satisfying an interest, not the same thing as satisfying a position. Very often we can satisfy interests, even if we can't satisfy a position. Third principle is the reason you join the legislature, that creative process of coming up with elegant solutions to the problem, trying to cobble together a deal that satisfies the maximum amount of interest. Maybe some of those are low cost for you to give away and very high value for them to take home. And then finally, this concept of legitimacy, some standard that reins in the conversation and makes it fair. So if we were live in the room now, we would do a second simulation. I would hand out another role for you to play. We'd pair you up again with a partner, and we try to apply these principles in a second, more legislative, not tea kettle flea markets scenario. But again, in Zoom, we can't do that. So I'm going to spend the remainder of our time together talking about 4 key tips that I think can help us negotiate more successfully in the legislative environment. Particularly, I want you to think about it as it relates to the redistricting battles that you're about to find yourself a part of. So let's put them in that context and think of them in terms of that context. So the first tip comes along this idea of expanding the pie. Earlier, I said that the whole spirit of interest-based negotiation was to expand that pie first before we start to chop it up. You do better for yourself, they do better for themselves. If you're willing to accept their betterness, you'll get your betterness. But it's one thing for me to say, you need to expand the pie. It's another thing for me to tell you how to expand the pie. And negotiation theory has a number of different ways that you might do that. We don't have a ton of time to explore all those, but I'm going to give you one here today. And that is to add, when you find yourself unable to expand the pie and you're really stuck in a bad scenario, add new stakeholders. Get other people involved in a negotiation, get other people to the table. When you add new stakeholders, you automatically add new interests. So you expand the interest pool. And the more interests you have, the more options you now have to cobble together a solution that works for all parties. I add a second element to this. Don't just add any new stakeholder to the table. Add someone to their side of the table. Someone whose interests align more with them than they do with you. Someone who they perceive as an ally on their side rather than someone that's an adversary on your side. Why is that the best type of stakeholder to add into the scenario? It's twofold. One, it increases momentum toward an agreement or a deal because that person often has different interests that they want to satisfy, and they are eager to get those interests met, and so they create a little kind of snowball effect and momentum towards a deal. The second thing is, when they're on the other side of the table, that person you've been negotiating with sees them as their partner and ally, and if they are inclined to take the deal, it puts a little bit of pressure, nudges them toward the agreement, toward the deal as well. I'm going to give you a real life example for this. If you can see behind me in my Zoom setup here, you see some renderings of some homes. As a side hustle, a partner and I here in Denver have a home building company. We built about 50 custom homes in Denver. And we often find ourselves, as you might imagine, as a seller of homes in a negotiation loggerheads with a prospective buyer. Whenever that happens, whenever we're stuck, the way I expand the pie is I bring a new stakeholder to the table. And the person I bring is not our broker, our real estate agent. I bring their real estate agent, the person who sits on their side of the table. Because that person brings a new interest, which is their commission, which is completely different than the interest we're talking about. And they want that commission. They want that interest satisfied, and they put mild, polite pressure, and since they're perceived as an ally, it very often is the thing that helps close the deal. So that's the first tip I have. The second tip goes back to interest, but it's thinking about interest in a bigger, broader way. And this is that preparation. You got to think, get in their mind a little bit before you actually start the conversation. And don't ignore the elephant in the room. Don't just think about the interests that are germane to the thing that you are negotiating, the transportation bill, the education bill, the redistricting maps. Think about their political interests too. Let's just be honest. In the legislature, sometimes the key interest that a negotiator has is completely unrelated to the topic on the table, the legislative element. Sometimes it's about their own ambition to be in leadership or a funder or supporter that they need to satisfy. Sometimes it's about their reelection prospects. You need to consider interests that they're not talking about that are political, because sometimes if you can simply satisfy that, they will give you the deal as it relates to the topic that's actually legislative. So don't ignore those. They're there. They're shaping the process. They're having an impact on the conversation. And if you simply ignore them and talk about the stuff that's germane to the topic, then you're missing out on an opportunity to cobble together an option that satisfies some of those interests. Okay, remember, the spirit is to deliver, not to deny. And if you can deliver a political interest very often, you make it much more likely that you come to a deal. Third tip out of 4 here falls under the sort of overall umbrella of, but what if they? But what if they keep moving the goalposts? What if they play hardball? What if they walk away from agreements that we've already had on the day before? And all that sort of, to me, falls under the umbrella of, what if they're being a jerk? So this is my second time I have to explain this to maybe the younger members of the audience. The Jerk was this wonderful movie by this comedian named Steve Martin. It's really funny in the 70s. If you want to see it, it's probably on one of the streaming services. Just a little plug for The Jerk. What if they are being a jerk? Well, I guess I have 4 responses if they're being a jerk. The first is, let's be honest. You wouldn't still be negotiating if either side could unilaterally impose an outcome on the other side. If you had the power to make them do what you wanted them to do, you'd do it. And if they had the power to make you do what they wanted you to do, they'd do it. The fact that you're still negotiating means that there are some interests out there that neither of you can by force claim. And so you still have to have that conversation, regardless how jerky they may be to you. Second, you either keep talking or you have to turn and look at your BATNA. All the alternatives that you have if you can't make a deal with them. And if none of those, if your best alternative, your BATNA, is not good, you better keep talking no matter how much of a jerk they are, how many tactics they're using that you think are unfair. If you've got a good BATNA, then maybe you go ahead and just take that BATNA. But if you have a bad BATNA, you have to keep talking. Now, some of you are going, but what if they won't talk at all? What if they're so jerky that they won't even engage in a dialogue with you? They see you coming down the hallway and they run the other way. They see you coming across the chamber floor and they hide under their desk. Well, then this is an important time to add a new stakeholder, because there's nothing in negotiation theory that says I need to directly interact with my negotiation partner face to face. I can create a chain of relationships and partners that lead me to that person. So if they won't talk to me, fine. But I know Phil or Sally, and they'll talk to Phil or Sally, and I can now have a proxy negotiator make that happen. And that really, this what they're being a jerk thing and bringing this new stakeholder in really leads us to the most important tip that I can give you for negotiating legislation. It's quite obvious to you, but I'm going to say it anyway, and that is, relationships are absolutely crucial if you're going to succeed at this interest-based negotiation mindset. It simply can't happen without them. You need to have the conversation. You need to have a relationship that allows you to have the conversation, ask those why questions that uncover those interests, or those what if we that assess options. You need to have a relationship so that you can trust those standards of legitimacy that you bring to the table or that they bring to the table. Now, some of you are saying, but what if we don't have a relationship? What if it's so broken? And of course, we see that with this polarization and partisanship that we have today, or sometimes even within our own caucus. Relationships are broken. Third time now, I'm going to go back and say, then get someone else involved. You don't have to do it with the person you have a relationship with. Find a chain, a connect the dots of relationship and negotiate through that chain. Changes the dynamic in powerful ways. So we're coming to the close of our time. Let's wrap up and do a quick review of what we've learned and experienced and thought about so far today. You have two choices. As I said before, I'm not a preacher for one or the other. You can be a positional bargainer, dance to the middle, or you can adopt the mindset of interest-based negotiation. If you do, it's the real difference between that fixed pie oppositional mindset and this idea of expanding the pie first before we actually carve that thing up, to deliver, not to deny, to try to beat you, not beat them, which means you have to allow them to win some things as well. The spirit is deliver rather than deny. And you're going to focus on those interests and options instead of those flags that are flying, those positions that often can't be satisfying. And the big thing is that you are seeing them. You go into that conversation thinking of them, even if they're a jerk, as your negotiating partner, not your negotiating opponent. So if we were in the room, this is the term I've referenced that, if we're in the room together today, I would end with a final exam. And you'd be like, oh, I didn't know there was going to be a quiz at the end. And there would be. And I'd say this, I'd say everybody at your table, lock up in the traditional arm wrestling posture. And then I'd announce the rules of the game. For 15 seconds, I'm going to time you, and you get 1 point every time your opponent's hand hits the table. You mark, get set, go. And I'd look around the room. Some of you would be failing the final exam. Some of you would be locked up in mortal battle, trying to get the other person's hand down. And at the end of 15 seconds, you'd have 0 or maybe 1 point. But some of you would be acing the final exam. I'd look around the room and I'd see some people have figured this out. And in 15 seconds, they might have 30 or more points each. And therein lies the difference between positional bargaining and interest-based negotiation. Hopefully, those of you out there today would have aced this final exam. And with that, I bring our Art of Legislative Negotiation session to a close. Hope I've given you something useful that you can take back into what would have been the redistricting wars and maybe turn them into a redistricting conversation where creative minds come together to cobble together the best, elegant, optimal solutions to satisfy the maximum number of interests for all possible parties. Seems a little like a naive pipe dream given the world we live in, but it's got to start somewhere. And I hope that maybe some of you, it will start with you. So last thing I want to say, if you'll indulge me for a quick commercial, we barely scratched the theory of the surface of negotiation theory, particularly as it relates to legislatures here today. In 1 hour, that we can hardly get deep into it. But if you want more, if you're really interested in this and you really want to develop this skill set, we have a legislative negotiation network. Send me an email at that address there, and I will add you to it. And sometime here in 2021, we did one in 2020, you'll get an invite from American University for a longer deep dive workshop, usually a day or two, hopefully live at American, and we would be happy to support that financially, your travel there, but maybe virtual, depending on how the world unfolds in 2021. We had a great group of 30 go and do it this summer, and we're hoping to have another group this summer. So if you really want to take this to the next level, you want to learn way more, do some real simulations in the room, and apply these principles in a far more powerful way, please send me an email. I'll be happy to add you to that, and you will get that invite sometime in 2021. Other than that, I hope you have a very wonderful rest of your redistricting seminar. Thank you so much for investing in yourself to come out and learn all these things so that you can go back and do the best for the people in your state. And I want to thank you on behalf of myself for being here this morning, but on behalf of NCSL for all the work that you do out there. We know that it's not just a thankless world, but I also use the term it's an anti-thank world. Sometimes you're anti-thanked for selflessly and tirelessly working to make the lives of your constituents and the citizens of your states better. And so for a group that knows that better than almost anyone else, certainly better than your friends, maybe even better than your spouse, NCSL thanks you for that service. Thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll stick around and answer any questions if anyone has any. And if not, I know you got things you got to do. Go off and do those. Orlando, you can probably turn off the I can't mute myself function so that people can unmute themselves. And if they have a question, I am happy to indulge that. Otherwise, have a wonderful session, a wonderful day, and a wonderful redistricting seminar. I think you can unmute yourself at this time. So if you got a question, okay, Orlando said you can unmute yourself. So if you got a question, just go ahead and bravely unmute, and I'm happy to indulge it. Okay, going once, going twice, gone. All right, everybody, have a great 2021. Stay safe out there. Have a great session. We'll see you all down the road, hopefully live in a room somewhere. Take care, everybody.